Elena's hands trembled as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to boots pound down the corridor outside. The baby in her arms did not cry. It was as if the infant already understood that silence meant survival. Elena closed her eyes and counted the footsteps, praying they would pass. They did not stop. They grew louder. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak door, voices rose in argument, sharp and urgent, the kind of voices that came before something terrible happened. Elena had served in this house for 6 years. She knew every creak in the floor, every hidden passage behind the tapestries, every shortcut a servant could take without being seen. Tonight, for the first time, none of that knowledge felt like enough. She had been carrying a tray of warm bread to the nursery when she overheard 2 men speaking in low, clipped tones near the kitchen stairs. They spoke of the queen. They spoke of the child. They spoke of finishing what had been started at midnight. Elena had frozen behind a stack of crates, her heart slamming against her ribs, and she had listened long enough to understand one terrible truth. Someone inside the king's own household wanted the infant princess dead before the night was over. She did not wait to hear more. She dropped the tray, ran up the back stairs 2 at a time, and burst into the nursery, to find the young queen already gone, taken in the first wave of violence that had swept through the eastern wing. The nurse who should have been guarding the cradle lay motionless near the window, and the baby was crying softly, wrapped in a blanket stitched with golden thread, the royal crest visible even in the dim candlelight. Elena did not think. She acted. She scooped up the child, tore away the blanket with the royal crest, wrapped the baby in a plain gray shawl instead, and slipped out through the servants' passage before anyone could see her leave. Now, minutes later, hidden in the narrow gap between 2 storage rooms, she listened as the search moved past her hiding place. When the footsteps finally faded down the far staircase, Elena allowed herself one shaking breath. She looked down at the baby, whose wide eyes stared back at her with a calm that unsettled her more than any scream could have. "I am sorry," Elena whispered. "I do not know your name yet. But I promise you, little one, you will live to hear it spoken with pride." She knew she could not stay in the territory. The pack was too large, too watchful, and whoever had orchestrated tonight's violence would not stop searching until they were certain the king's daughter was dead. Elena had no allies she trusted enough to call upon. She had only her own 2 feet, a stolen infant, and the vast, unfamiliar world beyond the border of Wolflands. She left through the old drainage tunnel behind the stables, a route she had discovered by accident years earlier while chasing a runaway hound. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of damp earth, but it opened onto a hillside far from the main gates, hidden by a thicket of wild bramble. Elena climbed out into the cool night air, the baby held tight against her chest, and looked back only once at the towering silhouette of the king's hall, its windows glowing orange with firelight and chaos. Then she turned and ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, following deer trails through the forest because she knew wolves patrolling the roads would move faster along open paths. She ran until the moon dipped low, and the baby, exhausted from crying, finally fell asleep against her shoulder. Only then did Elena allow herself to slow to a walk, her breath ragged, her mind racing through every possible plan and finding none of them safe enough. By dawn, she had crossed the river that marked the edge of the king's territory. She stood on the far bank, soaked to the knees, staring at the water rushing behind her, and felt something inside her shift. She was no longer a servant girl who followed orders. She was, whether she wanted the role or not, the only protector this child had left. The nearest human town was 2 days' walk from the border. Elena had visited it once before, on an errand for the household, and she remembered enough of its layout to know it would offer anonymity. Wolves rarely settled among humans, and even those who did tended to avoid small towns, where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was exactly the kind of place no one would think to search. She traveled carefully, avoiding main roads, sleeping in hollowed trees and abandoned barns, feeding the baby with what little supplies she had managed to grab before fleeing. By the time she reached the outskirts of the town, her clothes were torn, her feet blistered, and her arms ached from carrying the child for so many miles. But she was alive. The baby was alive. That was the only victory that mattered. She found a small house at the edge of town, half collapsed and clearly abandoned, and spent her first night there wrapped in the gray shawl with the sleeping infant curled against her. She stared at the ceiling. listening to the wind rattle the broken shutters, and made a decision that would shape the rest of both their lives. She would raise this child as her own. She would give her a new name, a new history, a new future, far from crowns and titles and the violence that came with them. She would never speak of the pack, never mention the king, never let a single word slip that could lead danger back to their door. It was the only way to keep the child safe, and Elena intended to keep her safe for as long as she drew breath. She named her Mara, a name Elena had heard once from a traveling merchant, simple and unremarkable, the kind of name that would draw no attention in a town full of ordinary families. She told the neighbors who eventually welcomed her that she was a young widow whose husband had died in a border skirmish, and that she had come to start a quiet life, far from painful memories. No one questioned her. Grief was common enough that no one thought to look closer. Elena found work at a bakery near the town square, kneading dough before sunrise and selling bread until dusk, earning just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. It was a hard life compared to the one she had known in the king's household, but it was safe, and safety was worth more to her than comfort ever could be. The years that followed were quiet, at least on the surface. Mara grew from an infant into a curious toddler, then into a bright young girl who asked endless questions about the world. Elena answered most of them honestly. She answered the ones about her father with careful silence, redirecting the conversation whenever Mara asked why she had no memories of him, why there were no pictures, why Elena's eyes filled with something like fear whenever the subject came up. Elena watched her daughter grow with a mixture of pride and quiet dread. Even as a small child, Mara displayed traits that set her apart from the other children in town. She healed from scrapes and bruises faster than seemed natural. Her eyes, a striking shade of amber, seemed to catch and hold light in a way that made strangers pause and stare a moment too long. Elena taught her to keep her sleeves down, to avoid direct sunlight when her eyes seemed to glow faintly at dusk, to never, under any circumstances, let anyone see her run at full speed. "Why can't I run in the fields like the other children?" Mara asked one afternoon, no older than 6, her small hands balled into frustrated fists. Elena knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "Because you are special, my love, and sometimes, being special means being careful. One day, when you are older, I will explain everything. Until then, I need you to trust me." Mara, young as she was, nodded slowly. She did not understand the reason, but she understood her mother's fear, and that fear was enough to make her obedient, even when curiosity gnawed at her late into the night. Elena kept careful watch on any strangers who passed through town, any traveler who lingered too long near their small house, any merchant who asked too many questions about where she had come from. Twice in those early years, she uprooted their life entirely and moved to a different town after spotting someone she recognized from her days in the king's household, someone who might recognize her in return. Each move cost them dearly, both in coin and in the fragile sense of stability Elena tried so hard to build for her daughter. But each move also bought them more time, more distance, more safety. She thought often of the king during those long nights when sleep would not come. She wondered if he had noticed his daughter was missing, if he mourned her, if he had ever discovered that his own household had betrayed him from within. She wondered if he searched for the child at all, or if he believed, as she had intended everyone to believe, that the princess had died alongside her mother that terrible night. Elena told herself it did not matter. Whatever grief or guilt the king carried was not her burden. Her only responsibility was the small, growing girl asleep in the next room, the girl who called her mother with complete and unquestioning love, unaware that the word carried a secret heavy enough to shake an entire kingdom if it were ever spoken aloud to the wrong ears. Still, some nights, Elena allowed herself to wonder what Mara's life might have been like if that night had never happened. Silk instead of wool, guards instead of neighbors, a father who loved her instead of a mother who lived in constant fear on her behalf. But wondering never changed anything, and Elena had long since learned that survival left little room for regret. By the time Mara turned 10, they had settled into what felt, for the first time, like a real home. A small cottage on the edge of a farming town called Millbrook, far enough from wolf territory that Elena rarely felt the need to look over her shoulder. Mara attended the local school, made friends among the other children, and showed a natural talent for solving problems that impressed even the school teacher. a kind older woman named Margaret who often praised Mara's sharp mind. Elena allowed herself, cautiously, to believe they might finally be safe. She allowed herself to imagine a future where Mara grew up ordinary, married someone kind, lived a long and unremarkable life, far from the dangers of the world Elena had fled. It was a fragile hope, built on 10 years of careful choices and a great deal of luck, but it was hope nonetheless. She did not yet know that hundreds of miles away, in a hall she had not seen in a decade, a king who refused to stop searching had just received a report that would change everything. A traveler, passing through the region near the river, had mentioned a woman and child who arrived in a border town the same season the princess disappeared. The report was thin, unconfirmed, one of dozens of false leads the king's men had chased over the years. But something about this particular account caught the attention of a guard named Cade, a man who had once sworn a personal oath to protect the missing princess, and had never forgiven himself for failing that night. Cade requested permission to investigate the lead personally. The king, weary from a decade of dead ends but unable to extinguish the last ember of hope in his chest, granted it. In Millbrook, Elena tucked Mara into bed that same evening, brushing a strand of dark hair from her daughter's forehead, unaware that the careful, quiet life she had built was about to begin unraveling, one small thread at a time. Cade traveled alone, dressed as an ordinary merchant, his wolf senses masked beneath layers of human clothing and a carefully practiced calm. He carried only a small satchel and a folded portrait sketch of the late queen, drawn from memory by an old court artist who still remembered her face. If the child had survived, Cade reasoned, she might carry some resemblance strong enough to notice. He reached Millbrook on a warm afternoon in early autumn, the streets busy with farmers selling the last of the season's harvest. He walked slowly through the market square, letting his senses stretch outward, the way his training had taught him, searching for anything unusual, any trace of wolf scent beneath the thick smell of hay and livestock. He found nothing conclusive that first day. Millbrook was a town of humans, ordinary and unremarkable, and if a wolf lived among them, she had learned to hide herself well. Cade took a room at the local inn and settled in for what he expected would be a long, patient search. Elena, meanwhile, noticed the stranger almost immediately. She had spent 10 years training herself to notice strangers, to catalog their faces, their questions, their reasons for lingering in a town that offered little to outsiders. Something about the man at the market unsettled her, though she could not immediately say why. He moved with a careful, deliberate grace that reminded her uncomfortably of the guards who once patrolled the king's hall. She said nothing to Mara, not wanting to frighten her daughter over what might be nothing more than an ordinary traveler passing through. But that night, after Mara had fallen asleep, Elena sat awake at the kitchen table, staring at the door, listening for footsteps that never came. 3 days passed. Cade lingered in Millbrook, asking careful, casual questions at the bakery, the schoolhouse, the tavern, gathering small pieces of information, the way a patient hunter gathers tracks. He learned of a widow named Elena who had arrived in town roughly a decade earlier with an infant daughter. He learned the daughter's name was Mara. He learned she attended the local school and was known for her quick mind and unusually striking amber eyes. It was the mention of the eyes that made Cade's pulse quicken. The late queen had possessed the same rare amber color, a trait so uncommon among wolves that only a handful of bloodlines carried it. It could have been coincidence. Cade had chased coincidences before, only to find them hollow, but something told him this lead was different. He arranged to walk past the schoolhouse the following afternoon, timing his stroll to coincide with the end of lessons. Children spilled out of the small building, laughing and chasing one another across the yard, and Cade watched carefully, searching each young face for the one detail that might confirm or destroy the last hope he carried. He saw her within moments, a girl with dark hair and striking amber eyes, laughing at something a friend had said, moving with an easy grace that seemed almost too fluid for an ordinary human child. Cade's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance to the late queen was unmistakable, not identical, but close enough to send a jolt of certainty through him. He did not approach her. He did not want to frighten the child or alert whoever was protecting her that they had been discovered. Instead, he retreated to the edge of the market and watched from a distance as Elena arrived to walk Mara home, her eyes scanning the street with the practiced wariness of someone who had spent years expecting danger to arrive without warning. Cade recognized that wariness. He had seen it before, in soldiers who had survived too many ambushes, in servants who had lived through too many purges. Elena was not simply a cautious mother. She was someone who had learned, through hard experience, that safety could never be taken for granted. He decided, for the moment, to remain patient. Confronting Elena directly risked driving her into hiding once again, and Cade had no intention of losing this lead after 10 years of failure. Instead, he would observe, gather more evidence, and send word back to the king, only when he was certain beyond doubt. Elena, for her part, felt the weight of being watched settle over her like a physical thing. She could not name the feeling precisely, only that something in the rhythm of the town had shifted, some subtle wrongness that made the hair on her arms rise whenever she stepped outside. She began walking Mara to and from school personally, despite her daughter's protests that she was old enough to walk alone. She began locking the cottage door earlier each evening, checking the windows twice before bed. "Mother, why are you so nervous lately?" Mara asked one evening, watching Elena pace near the window instead of sitting down to dinner. Elena forced a smile, the same practiced smile she had used for years to hide her fear. "I am not nervous, my love. Only tired. Eat your supper before it grows cold." Mara did not fully believe her, but she had long since learned not to push when her mother's voice took on that particular careful tone. She ate her supper in silence, glancing occasionally toward the window where Elena continued to watch the darkening street outside. That night, after Mara had gone to bed, Elena slipped out of the cottage and walked the quiet lanes of Millbrook, searching for any sign of the man she had noticed days earlier at the market. She found no trace of him, but the unease did not fade. Some instinct, honed over a decade of careful survival, told her that their time in Millbrook was drawing to a close. She began, quietly and without telling Mara, to prepare for the possibility of leaving again. She set aside small amounts of coin from her earnings at the bakery. She mentally catalogued which of their few possessions could be carried quickly, and which would have to be left behind. She had done this twice before, and though it broke her heart to consider uprooting Mara's life once more, she would do it 100 times over if it meant keeping her daughter safe. Cade, unaware of the growing unease he had caused, spent his final days in Millbrook, confirming details of the timeline. He learned from the innkeeper that Elena had arrived in the region roughly 10 years earlier, matching almost exactly the timing of the princess's disappearance. He learned from a farmer that Elena rarely spoke of her past, deflecting questions with practiced ease whenever the subject arose. Every detail added weight to his growing certainty. On his final evening in Millbrook, Cade composed a careful letter to the king, choosing his words with great precision. He did not want to raise false hope, not after a decade of disappointment, but he could not in good conscience withhold what he had discovered. He described the girl's eyes, her age, her resemblance to the late queen, and the mother's clear pattern of careful, deliberate secrecy. He sealed the letter and arranged for it to be carried swiftly back to the king's territory by a trusted courier, a young wolf, who could cover the distance in half the time it had taken Cade to travel on foot. Then he settled in to wait, uncertain whether his next instructions would be to return home or to remain in Millbrook and watch the girl who might, against all odds, be the king's long-lost daughter. Elena felt the shift in the air the following morning, though she could not have explained how. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding for no reason she could identify, and lay in the darkness listening to the quiet sounds of the cottage settling around her. Mara slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that far away, a letter was already traveling toward a king who had never stopped believing his daughter might still be alive. Elena rose, dressed quietly, and began the day as she always did, kneading dough at the bakery before the sun had fully risen. But her hands moved with less certainty than usual, and twice she caught herself staring out the window toward the road that led out of town, wondering how much time they had left before everything she had built came crashing down around them. The letter reached King Darius on a gray morning, delivered by a breathless courier who had ridden through the night without rest. Darius read it standing in the middle of his private study, his hands gripping the parchment so tightly, the edges crumpled beneath his fingers. He read it once, then again, then a third time, as though repetition might change the careful, cautious words into something more certain. For 10 years, Darius had carried the weight of that terrible night like a stone lodged permanently beneath his ribs. He had lost his mate in the violence, had been told his daughter died alongside her, and had spent every year since hunting the traitors responsible, while refusing, against all advice, to fully accept that his child was gone. His advisors called it grief, clouding his judgment. His closest friends called it stubborn hope. Darius had stopped trying to explain it to anyone. He simply knew, in some place deeper than logic, that he could not stop looking until he had proof, one way or another. Now, for the first time in a decade, that proof felt within reach. He summoned his most trusted advisor, an older wolf named Edwin who had served the royal family for 3 generations, and who had been present the night of the attack. Edwin read the letter in silence, his expression carefully neutral, though Darius could see the flicker of cautious hope in his old friend's eyes. "We have chased leads before," Edwin said slowly, setting the letter down. "Every one of them ended in disappointment." "I know," Darius said, "but Cade is not a man given to wild claims. If he believes this warrants attention, then it warrants attention." Edwin nodded slowly. "What would you have us do?" Darius was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the vast territory stretched beneath him. Forests and hills and rivers he had ruled for over a decade, without the one thing that might have made the burden bearable. "I want more information before we act. I will not descend upon some innocent woman's home and terrify a child over unconfirmed suspicion. Send word to Cade. Tell him to continue observing, carefully, quietly. I want confirmation before we move." Edwin bowed and left to carry out the order, and Darius remained alone in his study, staring at the letter until the words blurred together. He allowed himself, cautiously, to imagine what it might mean if the report proved true. A daughter, alive, grown into a girl of 10 years, raised by a stranger in a town he had never visited, carrying blood, and a birthright she likely knew nothing about. He thought of his mate, of the gentle way she had held their daughter in the brief hours before the attack, of the promise he had made to protect their child with his life. He had failed that promise once, catastrophically, and the guilt of it had shaped every decision he had made since. If there was even the smallest chance to correct that failure now, he intended to pursue it with everything he had. Meanwhile, within the pack itself, whispers began to circulate. Servants who had overheard fragments of conversation between Darius and Edwin spoke quietly among themselves, wondering aloud whether the king's long search had finally borne fruit. The rumors spread slowly at first, then more quickly, moving through the territory like ripples across still water. Not everyone within the pack greeted the news with hope. A council member named Rosalind, who had risen to considerable power during the years of the king's grief-driven distraction, felt a cold unease settle over her upon hearing the rumors. Rosalind had been among those who benefited most from the chaos of that terrible night 10 years earlier, though few beyond her closest allies knew the true depth of her involvement. The death of the queen, and the presumed death of the princess, had cleared a path for Rosalind's own family to gain influence within the council. Influence she had spent a decade carefully consolidating. If the princess was truly alive, if she returned to claim her birthright, Rosalind's carefully built position would be threatened, and worse, the truth of what had actually happened that night might finally surface. Rosalind had told herself for 10 years that the past was buried, that no one remained who could connect her to the violence that had claimed the queen's life. The rumors now circulating through the pack threatened to unearth exactly what she had worked so hard to keep hidden. She called a quiet meeting with 2 trusted allies that same evening, meeting in a private chamber far from prying ears. "We cannot allow this rumor to gain further ground," Rosalind said, her voice low and controlled, despite the anxiety churning beneath her calm exterior. "If the king believes his daughter has been found, he will move heaven and earth to bring her home. We need to know what Cade has discovered, and we need to know before the king acts on it." One of her allies, a younger wolf named Callum who owed his position entirely to Rosalind's patronage, nodded grimly. "I can attempt to intercept correspondence between Cade and the king. It will not be easy. Edwin guards the king's private communications closely." "Do what you must," Rosalind said, "but do it carefully. If anyone suspects we are interfering, everything we have built will collapse." Callum bowed and departed to begin his quiet, dangerous work, unaware that his efforts would soon place him directly in Cade's path. In Millbrook, Elena's unease continued to deepen with each passing day. She had not seen the stranger from the market again, but the feeling of being watched had not left her. She spoke with Margaret, the schoolteacher, under the pretense of casual conversation, asking whether any new families had recently settled in town, whether Margaret had noticed any unfamiliar faces lingering near the school. Margaret, sensing nothing unusual in the question, mentioned only the traveling merchant who had passed through earlier that season, and asked a surprising number of questions about the local families before departing. Elena's blood ran cold at the description. It matched, almost precisely, the stranger she had noticed at the market. That evening, Elena made her decision. They would leave Millbrook within the week. She began quietly packing their most essential belongings, telling Mara only that a wonderful opportunity had arisen in a nearby town, that they would be moving somewhere new and exciting. Mara, though disappointed to leave her friends and the school she had grown to love, had learned over the years not to question her mother's decisions too deeply. "Will we ever stop moving?" Mara asked one evening, watching Elena fold clothing into a worn traveling bag. Elena paused, her hands stilling over the fabric. It was a question she had dreaded for years, one she had never found a satisfying answer to. "One day," she said finally softly, "one day, my love, we will find a place we never have to leave. I promise you that." Mara nodded, though the sadness in her eyes suggested she had heard similar promises before, and had learned, quietly, not to place too much faith in them. Cade, still stationed in Millbrook awaiting further instruction from the king, noticed the sudden flurry of activity at Elena's small cottage. Crates being loaded onto a borrowed cart, neighbors bidding careful, hurried farewells. It was clear, even from a distance, that Elena intended to leave the town, and soon. He faced an impossible decision. He could allow her to disappear again, potentially losing the strongest lead the king had received in 10 years, or he could act now, revealing himself before he had received the king's explicit permission to do so. Cade thought of the years the king had spent grieving, of the desperate hope contained in that letter he had sent, and made his choice. He would follow them. Wherever Elena intended to flee, he would track their path discreetly, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection, while ensuring he did not lose them entirely. It was a risk, but Cade had chased too many false leads over the years to let a genuine one slip through his fingers now. He packed his own belongings that same evening, preparing to follow the woman and child into whatever uncertain future awaited them, unaware that his decision would soon collide with Rosalind's desperate efforts to keep the truth buried forever. Elena and Mara left Millbrook before dawn, the cart loaded with what little they could carry, the rest of their modest life left behind for whoever might find use of it. Mara sat quietly beside her mother, watching the familiar houses and fields disappear behind them, a heavy sadness settling in her chest that she did not fully understand. She had left towns before, but something about this departure felt different, more urgent, though Elena refused to explain why. They traveled for 2 days along winding country roads, staying in small inns when they could afford it, and sleeping beneath the stars when they could not. Elena watched the road behind them constantly, her senses stretched thin with exhaustion and vigilance. She saw nothing unusual, no sign of pursuit, and slowly allowed herself to believe they had simply been cautious rather than genuinely threatened. She was wrong. Cade followed at a careful distance, close enough to track their movement, but far enough to remain unseen, his years of training allowing him to move through the countryside like a shadow. He watched them settle into a new town called Ashford, a slightly larger community built around a busy trading post, and observed as Elena secured work at a local seamstress shop, while Mara enrolled in the town's small school. Cade sent a second letter to the king, this one more detailed than the first, describing Elena's clear pattern of flight whenever she sensed potential danger, a pattern that only strengthened his conviction that she was protecting something, or someone, of tremendous importance. The letter took longer to arrive this time, delayed by a stretch of heavy rain that flooded several of the major roads leading toward the king's territory. In the delay, Callum, working quietly on Rosalind's behalf, managed to intercept a courier carrying royal correspondence, though not the letter Cade had sent. Instead, Callum discovered fragments of an earlier exchange between Darius and Edwin, enough to confirm that the king believed a serious lead had emerged regarding his missing daughter. Callum reported back to Rosalind immediately, his expression grim. The king believes Cade has found her. I do not know where, and I do not know how certain the evidence is. But the king is taking this seriously enough to keep his own council informed, only in careful whispers. Rosalind absorbed this information with outward calm, though her mind raced beneath the surface. We need to find Cade before he brings this girl back to the territory. If she arrives here, surrounded by the king's protection, there will be nothing more we can do. We must intervene, while she is still vulnerable. Callum hesitated. What exactly are you proposing? Rosalind's expression hardened. I am proposing that we ensure this girl never reaches the king's territory at all. If the search ends in tragedy rather than triumph, the rumors will fade, the king's grief will run its course, as it should have years ago, and everything we have built will remain secure. Callum felt a chill settle over him at the implication behind her words, but he had followed Rosalind's guidance for too many years to refuse her now. He nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him as he departed to begin tracking Cade's movements through whatever contacts remained loyal to Rosalind's cause. In Ashford, life settled into a fragile new rhythm. Mara, resilient as always, made new friends quickly, though she confided to Elena one evening that she missed Millbrook more than she had expected to. Elena listened to her daughter's quiet grief, with a familiar ache in her chest, the same ache she felt every time their life together demanded another sacrifice from a child who had never asked for any of it. I know it is hard, Elena said, sitting beside Mara on the edge of her narrow bed. I know I have asked you to leave behind more than any child should have to, but everything I do to keep you safe. One day, you will understand why. You keep saying that, Mara said, her voice carrying a note of frustration she rarely allowed herself to express. One day I will understand. One day we will stop moving. When is one day, Mother? Elena had no honest answer to offer, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, before Mara finally sighed and turned onto her side, signaling the end of the conversation. Elena remained sitting on the edge of the bed long after her daughter's breathing evened into sleep, staring at nothing, wondering how much longer she could sustain the careful lies that had protected them for a decade. Cade, observing from a distance, began to notice something troubling in his own surroundings. Twice within his first week in Ashford, he caught the scent of an unfamiliar wolf lingering near his lodgings, a scent that vanished each time he attempted to track its source. He recognized the careful, deliberate pattern of someone trained to avoid detection, and his instincts, honed over years of service, told him he was no longer the only one watching Elena and Mara. He increased his own caution significantly, varying his routes through town, changing his patterns of observation, and sending word to Edwin requesting additional support be dispatched to Ashford as quickly as possible. He did not yet know who was tracking him, but every instinct he possessed told him the danger was real and growing. Edwin, upon receiving Cade's urgent request, brought the matter directly to Darius. Someone within our own ranks may be working against us, Edwin said grimly. Cade believes he is being followed, and if that is true, it suggests someone learned of our search and does not wish for it to succeed. Darius's expression darkened. Rosalind. Edwin did not confirm or deny the suspicion aloud, but his silence spoke clearly enough. Darius had long harbored quiet doubts about Rosalind's rapid rise to power in the years following the attack, though he had never possessed enough evidence to act on those suspicions. If she was indeed working to prevent his daughter's return, it would confirm a betrayal far deeper than he had previously imagined. Send additional guards to Ashford immediately, Darius ordered. I want Cade protected, and I want that woman and her child protected, whoever is responsible for threatening them. And Edwin, begin a quiet investigation into Rosalind's recent activities. If she is behind this, I want proof before I act, but I want that proof quickly. Edwin bowed and departed to set both orders into motion, the weight of a decade-long mystery finally beginning to unravel, in directions no one had fully anticipated. In Ashford, unaware of the danger converging around them, Elena continued her careful routine, believing, wrongly, that distance alone had kept them safe. The additional guards dispatched by Darius arrived in Ashford under careful disguise, posing as traveling merchants and craftsmen to avoid drawing attention. Cade met with them quietly on the outskirts of town, relieved to finally have allies who could help him watch for the unfamiliar wolf whose scent he had detected days earlier. We move carefully, Cade instructed the small group gathered around him. We do not know who is tracking us, or how many. Our priority is protecting the woman and the girl, not confronting whoever is following them. If we can identify our enemy without revealing ourselves, we gain the advantage." The guards nodded their understanding and dispersed to take up quiet positions around the edges of town, watching the roads, the market, the school where Mara spent her mornings learning alongside children who had no idea their classmate carried royal blood in her veins. Callum, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uneasy with the task Rosalind had assigned him. He had tracked Cade successfully to Ashford, confirming the location Rosalind needed, but the idea of causing harm to an innocent child sat poorly with him, no matter how many times Rosalind reminded him of the stakes involved. He found himself lingering on the edges of town, watching Mara from a careful distance as she walked to school each morning, laughing with her friends, entirely unaware of the danger circling her life. She looked, Callum thought, like an ordinary girl. Bright eyes, an easy laugh, a gentle way of helping a smaller child who had stumbled near the schoolhouse steps. Nothing about her suggested the political weight she unknowingly carried, and nothing in Callum's conscience could fully reconcile the image of this cheerful child with the violence Rosalind seemed prepared to unleash upon her. He returned to his lodgings that evening, deeply conflicted, torn between years of loyalty to Rosalind and a growing unease he could not silence. He sent a message requesting further instruction, phrasing his hesitation as caution rather than doubt, unwilling to reveal the true depth of his uncertainty. Rosalind's response arrived within a day, sharp and impatient. She instructed Callum to proceed swiftly, reminding him that hesitation now would only increase the danger to both of them should their involvement ever be discovered. Callum read the message twice, his hands unsteady, and made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. He would not harm the child, but neither could he openly betray Rosalind. Not yet. Not without proof that could protect him from her considerable influence within the council. Instead, he chose a middle path. He would delay, obstruct, and quietly ensure that whatever danger Rosalind intended never actually reached Mara, while appearing, from the outside, to still be carrying out his assigned task. It was a dangerous game, and Callum knew it. But it was the only path that allowed him to live with himself. In the days that followed, life in Ashford continued its careful, watchful rhythm. Elena noticed the increased presence of unfamiliar faces around town, but could not determine whether they represented friend or threat. She tightened her routines further, walking Mara to school personally each morning, timing their errands to avoid unnecessary exposure, and lying awake each night listening for sounds that never quite materialized into danger. Mara, sensing her mother's escalating anxiety, began to withdraw slightly, spending more time with her school friends and less time confiding in Elena about her day. It was a small distance, barely noticeable to anyone outside their small household, but Elena felt it keenly, another quiet cost of the secrets she had carried for a decade. One afternoon, walking home from the market, Elena noticed a man watching her from across the street, his posture too still, too deliberate to be an ordinary passerby. Her heart lurched painfully, and she quickened her pace toward the schoolhouse, desperate to reach Mara before whatever threat this man represented could act. The man, one of Darius's disguised guards, made no move to approach her. He had been instructed only to observe and report, not to intervene unless absolute danger presented itself. But Elena, unaware of his true purpose, spent the rest of that day in a state of controlled panic, certain that their location had finally been discovered by whoever had been hunting them for years. That evening, she made a decision she had been avoiding for a decade. She would tell Mara the truth, or at least enough of it to prepare her daughter for whatever might come. Mara deserved to understand why their life had always been shaped by fear, why they moved so often, why Elena flinched at unfamiliar faces and locked doors long before darkness fell. She sat Mara down at their small kitchen table that night, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and began to speak in a voice that trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. Something about where you came from, and why we have always had to be so careful. Mara's eyes widened, sensing immediately that whatever her mother was about to say would change everything she believed about her own life. She said nothing, only nodded for Elena to continue, her young heart pounding with a mixture of fear and long-awaited understanding. "I am not your birth mother," Elena said softly, the words she had carried silently for 10 years, finally spoken aloud. "I found you, the night your real family was in terrible danger. I took you away to keep you safe, and I have loved you every single day since, as though you were my own, because in every way that matters, you are. But your birth father is someone very powerful, someone who may still be searching for you even now." Mara sat in stunned silence, the kitchen suddenly feeling too small, too quiet, the weight of 10 years of unanswered questions crashing down upon her all at once. "Who am I?" she finally whispered. Elena reached across the table and took her daughter's trembling hands in her own. "You are Mara. You will always be Mara, no matter what I tell you next. But your birth father is a king, and you, my darling girl, are his daughter." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet cottage suddenly holding the weight of an entire kingdom's hidden history. Mara did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of the small room she had called her own for only a few short weeks, turning her mother's words over and over in her mind until they no longer felt real. A king, a father she had never met, never even known existed. A truth so enormous it made every quiet moment of her childhood feel like a carefully constructed illusion. She thought of every unanswered question she had asked over the years, every time Elena's eyes had filled with careful sorrow at the mention of her father, every sudden move to a new town that had never been fully explained. It all made sense now, in a way that felt both clarifying and devastating. She was not simply an ordinary girl who happened to heal quickly and see clearly in the dark. She was something else entirely, something Elena had spent a decade hiding from the world. In the morning, Mara found Elena already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with dark circles beneath her eyes, clearly having slept no better than her daughter. They sat together in heavy silence for a long moment before Mara finally spoke. "Why did you take me?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "If my father is truly a king, why did you not simply protect me within his household?" Elena's expression tightened with old grief. "Because the danger came from within his household. Someone close to him wanted you gone, wanted your entire family destroyed. I did not know who I could trust, and I did not have time to find out. I only had time to run." "Do you think he is still looking for me?" Mara asked. "I do not know," Elena admitted honestly. "But I believe you deserve to know the truth, even if it changes everything between us. I am sorry I waited so long to tell you." Mara absorbed this with a maturity that surprised even herself, the shock of the previous night settling into something steadier, more resolved. "I am not angry," she said slowly, though the tightness in her voice suggested the emotion beneath her words was more complicated than simple acceptance. "I understand why you did what you did, but I need time to understand what it means." Elena nodded, relief and lingering sorrow mixing together in her chest. "Take all the time you need, my love. I will still be here." Over the following days, Mara withdrew into quiet contemplation, spending long hours sitting near the small stream behind their cottage, watching the water move past, without any particular destination in mind. She did not fully understand what it meant to be the daughter of a king, could not picture herself in silk gowns or grand halls, could not reconcile the idea of royal blood with the simple, quiet life she had always known. But she also began to notice things about herself with new understanding. The way she healed faster than her friends when she scraped her knee. The way her eyes seemed to catch moonlight in ways that unsettled strangers. The way she sometimes felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest beyond town. An instinct she had never understood, but had always obeyed when Elena was not watching. She realized slowly, not entirely human, though the concept of what she actually was remained frustratingly vague, wrapped in Elena's careful half-explanations and years of deliberate silence. Meanwhile, the guards stationed around Ashford grew increasingly certain that danger was closing in. Cade, still tracking the unfamiliar scent that had first alerted him to potential surveillance, finally caught a clear trail leading toward the eastern edge of town, near an abandoned mill that had fallen into disrepair years earlier. He followed the trail cautiously, his senses fully alert, and discovered evidence that someone had been observing Elena's cottage from a hidden vantage point within the mill's upper floor. Fresh footprints, a discarded piece of cloth, the faint but unmistakable scent of a wolf who had spent considerable time in that exact location. Cade reported his findings immediately to the other guards, and together they began a careful, coordinated effort to identify and intercept whoever had been watching Elena and Mara from the shadows. They did not yet know it was Callum, torn between loyalty and conscience, still uncertain how to proceed with the impossible task Rosalind had assigned him. Callum, sensing the increased vigilance around the cottage, realized his position had grown considerably more precarious. He could not continue his surveillance without significant risk of discovery, yet abandoning the task entirely would raise Rosalind's suspicion and potentially expose the doubts he had been carefully concealing. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He would warn Elena, indirectly, of the danger surrounding her, without revealing his own identity or involvement. It was a risk, but one he felt compelled to take, unable to fully silence the conscience that had been growing louder with each passing day. That evening, as Elena walked home from the seamstress shop, she found a folded note tucked beneath her door, unsigned, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. The note contained only a few words, but they were enough to send a fresh wave of fear through her already exhausted heart. They know where you are. Trust no one who claims to serve the king until you have seen proof beyond doubt. Protect her. Elena stared at the note for a long moment, her hands trembling, unable to determine whether it represented a genuine warning or some elaborate trap designed to frighten her into a mistake. She burned the note in the kitchen fire that night, watching the paper curl and blacken, and made a decision that would once again upend the fragile life she had built for her daughter. They would leave Ashford immediately, before dawn if possible, moving toward the only place Elena had never dared consider before now. The border territory near the king's own lands, close enough that if the danger was real, they might find protection, and if it was a trap, at least they would be moving toward answers, rather than blindly fleeing into further uncertainty. She woke Mara gently, before the sun had risen, explaining only that they needed to leave immediately, that their safety depended on moving quickly and quietly. Mara, still processing the enormous truth she had learned only days earlier, asked no questions this time, simply gathering her few belongings and following her mother out into the cool, uncertain darkness of early morning. Elena and Mara traveled swiftly through the early morning mist, following a narrow forest path that Elena hoped would keep them hidden from any eyes watching the main roads. Mara moved silently beside her mother, her earlier questions replaced by a quiet, watchful alertness that had not existed in her before the truth had been revealed. It was as though learning of her true heritage had awakened something instinctive within her, a sharper awareness of the world around them. They had traveled perhaps 3 hours when Elena first sensed they were no longer alone, a rustle in the underbrush too deliberate to be a startled deer, a silence among the birds that suggested a predator moving nearby. Elena's pulse quickened, and she pulled Mara closer, scanning the trees for any sign of the threat she felt certain was approaching. The attack, when it came, happened with terrifying speed. A wolf emerged from the tree line, larger and more aggressive than any ordinary predator, moving directly toward them with clear and deliberate intent. Elena recognized immediately that this was no wild animal, but a shifted wolf, someone sent to finish what Rosalind had failed to accomplish through Callum's reluctant hesitation. Elena pushed Mara behind her, positioning herself between her daughter and the approaching threat, prepared to defend the child with everything she possessed, despite having no real means to fight a full-grown wolf. The creature lunged, and Elena barely managed to pull Mara aside in time, both of them stumbling backward as sharp claws tore through the air where Mara had stood only a moment earlier. What happened next occurred so quickly that Elena would spend years afterward trying to fully piece together the sequence of events. Mara, driven by an instinct she had never before accessed, moved to shield Elena from a second attack, throwing herself between her mother and the wolf's next lunge. Sharp claws caught across her collarbone, tearing through fabric and skin in a brutal, glancing blow that sent both of them tumbling to the forest floor. Elena screamed, scrambling to pull Mara away from further harm, but the wolf, seemingly startled by the fierce, protective growl that had torn unbidden from Mara's throat, hesitated for one crucial moment. That hesitation gave the guards, who had been tracking Elena's hurried departure from Ashford, just enough time to arrive. Cade burst through the tree line first, shifting mid-stride into his wolf form with practiced speed, intercepting the attacking wolf before it could strike again. The two wolves collided in a violent, controlled struggle, and within moments, the other guards arrived to overwhelm the attacker entirely, subduing him before he could cause further harm. Elena knelt over Mara, her hands pressed against the wound along her daughter's collarbone, tears streaming freely down her face as she begged Mara to stay awake, to keep breathing, to hold on just a little longer. The wound bled heavily at first, but within minutes, to Elena's mixture of relief and awe, the bleeding began to slow, the torn skin knitting itself back together, with the accelerated healing Elena had spent years teaching her daughter to hide from the world. Cade approached cautiously once the attacker had been fully subdued, his own wolf form still tense with adrenaline, and shifted back to his human shape as he knelt beside Elena and the recovering girl. He looked down at Mara's healing wound, at the distinctive crescent shape it had left behind across her collarbone, and felt his breath catch entirely in his chest. He had seen that exact mark before, in old portraits within the king's private hall, a birthmark, carried by the royal bloodline for generations, one that only manifested clearly during moments of significant physical trauma. He had heard stories of it his entire life, but had never expected to witness it appear on a living, breathing girl in the middle of an ordinary forest, blood still drying against her torn shirt. "It cannot be," Cade whispered, staring at the mark with something between disbelief and overwhelming relief. "It is truly her." Elena looked up sharply, her protective instincts flaring immediately despite her exhaustion. "Who are you? What do you want with my daughter?" "My name is Cade," he said gently, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I serve King Darius. I have spent months searching for evidence that his daughter survived that terrible night 10 years ago. I believe, without any remaining doubt, that your daughter is exactly who I hoped she might be." Elena's expression crumpled with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering terror. 10 years of careful secrecy, and now the truth had been revealed, not through her own choice, but through violence. Through a wound that had nearly cost Mara her life. She looked down at her daughter, still weak but conscious, staring up at Cade with wide, curious eyes. "Is it true?" Mara asked softly, her voice weak but steady. "Am I truly the king's daughter?" Cade knelt closer, his expression gentle, despite the gravity of the moment. "I believe so, with everything in my heart. And if I am right, your father has never once stopped searching for you, not for a single day across these past 10 years. Mara absorbed this information in stunned silence, her hand instinctively moving to touch the healing scar along her collarbone, the physical proof of a truth that would change the entire course of her life. Elena, watching her daughter process this enormous revelation, felt the familiar weight of fear settle over her once again, though this time, it was accompanied by something else entirely, a fragile, cautious hope that perhaps, after 10 years of running, they might finally be approaching the end of their long and difficult journey. The subdued attacker was brought back to Ashford under close guard, and it did not take long for Cade and his fellow guards to extract enough information to confirm what they had already suspected. The wolf had been sent by Callum, though he claimed, with evident fear, that he had acted under strict orders from someone far more powerful within the king's own council. He would not name Rosalind directly, too frightened of her reach to speak her name aloud even in captivity, but the details he provided left little doubt about who had orchestrated the attack. Cade sent an urgent message back to the king, describing not only the confirmation of Mara's identity, but also the attempted attack, and the growing evidence pointing toward betrayal within the king's own council. He requested immediate reinforcements to escort Elena and Mara safely to the king's territory, unwilling to risk another attempt on their lives during the journey. Darius received the news with an overwhelming surge of emotion that nearly brought the powerful king to his knees. His daughter, alive, confirmed beyond doubt after 10 years of searching. And yet, alongside the relief, came a fresh wave of fury at the confirmation that someone within his own household had orchestrated not only the original attack, but a second attempt on his daughter's life, a decade later. He summoned Edwin immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Rosalind." Edwin's expression remained grave. "The evidence gathered by your investigation over these past weeks aligns closely with what Cade has reported. I believe we have enough now to act." "Then we act," Darius said firmly, quietly, and without warning. "I will not allow her the opportunity to flee or cause further harm before justice can be served." Within the pack, word had already begun spreading rapidly, despite the king's best efforts to control the flow of information. The story of the king's daughter, discovered alive after a decade, injured in a forest attack, and revealed through an ancient birthmark passed down through generations, spread through the territory, with the speed and intensity reserved for only the most significant news. Some pack members wept openly with joy at the news. Others, loyal to Rosalind's faction, felt a growing unease as they realized their carefully built power structure now stood on the edge of collapse. Rosalind, sensing the shifting tide before official word had even reached her directly, understood immediately that her plans had failed catastrophically. She began making quiet preparations of her own, considering whether flight might offer better prospects than facing the king's justice, though she recognized with growing dread that escaping his reach would prove nearly impossible now that suspicion had fallen so clearly upon her. Darius's guards arrived at Rosalind's private chambers before she could fully act on any escape plan, moving with swift, coordinated precision under Edwin's direct command. She was taken into custody quietly, without the dramatic confrontation she might have expected, the king choosing careful control over public spectacle as the investigation into her decade of hidden betrayal formally began. Meanwhile, in Ashford, Elena tended to Mara's recovery with the same fierce devotion she had shown throughout the past 10 years, though the nature of her worry had shifted entirely. She no longer feared discovery. That fear had already come to pass, resolved not through disaster, but through what appeared, cautiously, to be genuine rescue, rather than renewed danger. Instead, she feared what might come next, whether the king would view her as a savior who had protected his daughter, or as a thief who had stolen a decade of his time with his own child. "What will happen to you?" Mara asked one evening, sitting up in bed as her wound continued healing rapidly, already reduced to a thin, pale scar across her collarbone. "If my father learns everything you did to protect me, will he be angry?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer false comfort when the truth remained genuinely uncertain. "I do not know, my love. I took his daughter without his knowledge, even though I believed it was the only way to save your life. He may see that as a kindness, or he may see it as an unforgivable crime. I have made my peace with whatever judgment awaits me, as long as you remain safe." Mara reached out and took her mother's hand, her expression fierce despite her lingering weakness. "I will not let anyone punish you for saving my life. Whatever happens, I will make sure he understands the truth." Elena's eyes filled with tears at her daughter's fierce loyalty. 10 years of careful, quiet sacrifice, suddenly feeling, for the first time, fully seen and appreciated. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever happens next, know that raising you has been the greatest honor of my life." Cade, overseeing the preparations for their journey toward the king's territory, worked to ensure their travel would be as safe and comfortable as possible, given the circumstances. Additional guards arrived from the territory to strengthen their escort, and within days, Elena and Mara found themselves traveling not as fugitives fleeing danger, but as honored guests moving steadily toward a reunion that had seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Mara watched the countryside change as they traveled, forests giving way gradually to more familiar wolf territory, the landscape itself seeming to whisper of the history she was only beginning to understand. She thought often of the father she had never met, wondering what he might be like, whether he would recognize anything of her mother in her face, whether 10 years of separation could ever truly be bridged. Elena, riding beside her daughter in the comfortable carriage the king had sent for their journey, watched Mara's quiet contemplation with a heart full of complicated emotion. Pride in the strong, resilient young woman her daughter had become, fear of what judgment might await her upon arrival, and beneath it all, a quiet, exhausted relief that after 10 years of constant vigilance, the truth had finally emerged into the light, whatever consequences that truth might bring. The king's territory appeared on the horizon on a clear afternoon, its familiar hall rising above the surrounding forest, exactly as Elena remembered it from 10 years earlier, though everything about her circumstances had changed entirely since the night she had fled through the old drainage tunnel with a crying infant in her arms. She felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as the carriage approached the main gates, the weight of a decade's secrets pressing heavily against her chest. Mara pressed her face gently against the carriage window, taking in her first sight of the place that represented her true heritage, a birthright she had known nothing about until mere weeks earlier. The hall looked grand and imposing, nothing like the simple cottages and small towns that had shaped her entire understanding of home, and she felt a fresh wave of nervous uncertainty settle over her as the carriage rolled to a stop within the main courtyard. King Darius stood waiting at the top of the stone steps, flanked by Edwin and several other trusted advisors, his expression carefully controlled, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath his composed exterior. He had waited 10 years for this moment, had imagined it countless times during sleepless nights, and yet nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming reality of watching the carriage door open and a young woman step out, who carried unmistakable traces of her late mother's face. For a long moment, neither of them moved, father and daughter simply staring at one another across the short distance of the courtyard, 10 years of separation, suddenly collapsing into a single, breathless silence. Then Darius descended the steps slowly, his usual regal composure faltering slightly as he approached, stopping just a few feet from the daughter he had never expected to see again. "Mara," he said softly, testing the name Elena had given her, finding it strange and precious all at once. "I have searched for you every single day since the night I lost you." Mara studied his face carefully, searching for some sense of recognition, some instinctive pull toward the man who had given her life, even though he had played no role in raising her. She found, to her surprise, a strange sense of familiarity in his eyes, the same distinctive amber shade she saw every time she looked in a mirror. "I did not know you existed until a few weeks ago," Mara admitted honestly. "My mother protected me my entire life without ever telling me the truth, until circumstances forced her hand." Darius's gaze shifted toward Elena, who stood beside the carriage with her chin held high despite the obvious fear evident in her posture. He studied her for a long moment, recognizing her vaguely from her years of service within his household, though a decade of hardship had changed her considerably from the young servant girl he remembered. "You are the one who took her," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Elena's heart clench painfully. "I am," Elena confirmed, refusing to look away despite her fear. "I overheard a plot to end her life that same night your household was attacked. I had no time to seek permission or find someone I could trust. I only had time to run, and I have spent every day since protecting her, as though she were my own daughter." Darius was quiet for a long moment, the courtyard silent, except for the distant sound of wind moving through the surrounding trees. Edwin watched carefully from the steps, uncertain which direction the king's judgment might fall, aware that the decision he made now would shape not only Elena's fate, but the entire pack's understanding of loyalty and sacrifice. "You could have brought her to me immediately," Darius said finally. "You could have trusted my guards, my household, to protect her properly." "I could not know who to trust," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "The danger came from within your own household. I did not know how far the betrayal extended, and I was not willing to risk her life on a guess. I am sorry if my choice caused you pain, but I do not regret keeping her alive." Mara stepped forward suddenly, positioning herself between Elena and her father with the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to shield Elena from the wolf attack weeks earlier. "She saved my life," Mara said firmly. "Not once, but every single day for 10 years. Whatever judgment you intend to pass, know that I will not accept any punishment against the woman who raised me with nothing but love and sacrifice." Darius studied his daughter's fierce defense of Elena, and something in his expression softened considerably, the anger and grief of 10 years slowly giving way to a more complicated understanding. He had spent a decade imagining countless scenarios for how his daughter might have survived, but he had never fully considered the depth of sacrifice required to keep a child alive and hidden for so many years. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay," Darius said finally, addressing Elena directly, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to display publicly. "You saved my daughter's life at tremendous personal cost, and you raised her with a love that is evident in every word she has spoken in her defense of you. I was prepared to judge you harshly for taking her from me, but I see now that judgment would be both unfair and ungrateful." Elena's composure finally broke, tears spilling freely down her face, as 10 years of accumulated fear and exhaustion released all at once. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You will remain here, within the territory, with whatever position and honor you desire," Darius continued. "You raised my daughter when I could not protect her myself, and that sacrifice deserves recognition, not punishment." The tension that had gripped the courtyard since their arrival finally began to dissolve, replaced by something more hopeful, more uncertain but undeniably positive. Mara looked between her father and the woman who had raised her, feeling for the first time since learning the truth that perhaps this new chapter of her life might hold more promise than fear. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Rosalind's decade-long betrayal moved forward with careful thoroughness under Edwin's direct oversight. Witnesses came forward, some out of genuine remorse, and others simply seeking to protect themselves once it became clear Rosalind's influence had collapsed entirely. Callum, still wrestling with the guilt of his own involvement, chose finally to speak the full truth, describing Rosalind's role in orchestrating both the original attack 10 years earlier and the more recent attempt on Mara's life in the forest outside Ashford. His honesty, though it came with its own consequences, was tempered by the genuine effort he had made to prevent harm from actually reaching Mara. Darius, weighing the full circumstances carefully, chose a measured judgment for Callum, one that acknowledged both his complicity and his eventual conscience, allowing him a path toward redemption through service rather than the harsher punishment Rosalind herself would face. Rosalind's own judgment proved considerably less merciful. The full extent of her decade-long manipulation, culminating in a direct attempt on the life of the king's own daughter, left little room for leniency. She was stripped of all rank and influence within the pack, and exiled from the territory entirely, her carefully constructed decade of power dismantled in a matter of weeks, once the truth finally emerged into the light. With the immediate danger resolved, the pack turned its attention toward the more joyful task of welcoming their long-lost princess home. A formal ceremony was arranged, one that would confirm Mara's identity before the full assembled pack, using the ancient bloodline rites that had verified royal succession for countless generations. Mara stood before the gathered crowd, nervous but resolute, as the pack's oldest elders examined the crescent-shaped scar along her collarbone, and confirmed, through ritual and careful tradition, what Cade had already suspected the moment he first saw the mark in that forest clearing. The pack's celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and laughter, and the kind of genuine joy that came only after years of uncertainty, finally resolving into hopeful clarity. Mara found herself surrounded by pack members eager to welcome her, some offering stories of her mother, the late queen, others simply expressing relief that the king's long grief might finally begin to heal. Elena watched the celebration from a quiet corner of the gathering, her heart full of complicated emotion as she observed her daughter, no, their daughter, surrounded by a warmth and belonging that Elena herself had worked so hard to provide in secret for so many years. She felt no jealousy at watching Mara embraced by this new world, only a deep, exhausted gratitude that the sacrifices of the past decade had finally led to this moment of genuine safety and joy. Darius approached her quietly during a lull in the festivities, watching his daughter laugh with a group of young wolves her own age, before turning his attention to Elena beside him. "She is remarkable," he said softly. "Strong, kind, quick-witted. You raised her well, despite everything working against you." "She raised herself into who she is," Elena replied honestly. "I only tried to keep her safe long enough to let her become it." Darius nodded slowly, understanding settling more fully into his expression. "I would like you to remain close to her, if you are willing. She will need time to adjust to this new life, and I suspect she will need your steady presence far more than she needs mine, at least for now." Elena felt fresh tears gathering, though these carried none of the fear that had defined so many of her tears over the past decade. "I would like nothing more." In the months that followed, Mara settled gradually into her new role within the pack, learning the customs and history that had been kept from her for so long, while never fully losing the grounded, practical nature that a decade of ordinary human life had instilled in her. She maintained a close relationship with Elena, visiting often, seeking her guidance during moments of uncertainty, refusing to let the grandeur of her new position diminish the bond forged through 10 years of quiet, devoted sacrifice. Her relationship with Darius grew more slowly, built carefully over shared meals and long conversations, each of them learning to bridge the decade of separation that had denied them the simple, ordinary moments most parents and children shared without a second thought. It was not always easy. There were moments of awkward silence, of unspoken grief for years that could never be reclaimed, but there was also, gradually, genuine warmth and connection growing between them. Cade remained within the king's service, honored for his role in finally uncovering the truth after years of dedicated searching. and he became, over time, one of Mara's closest friends within the territory, someone who understood better than most the long and difficult journey that had brought her home. Nearly a year after that fateful reunion in the courtyard, the pack gathered once more, this time for a formal ceremony recognizing Mara as the official heir to the king's territory, a role she approached with the same thoughtful determination that had defined her entire life. She stood before the assembled crowd, her father beside her, Elena watching proudly from nearby, and felt, for the first time in her memory, the complete and settled sense of belonging that a decade of constant movement had never allowed her to fully experience. She thought often, during quiet moments, of the winding path that had brought her to this place. The forest cottage, where she had grown up unaware of her true heritage. The countless towns she and Elena had called home, each one a temporary shelter against a danger she had not understood until it nearly cost her life. The scar along her collarbone faded now to a thin silver line that had revealed the truth she had carried without knowing for the entirety of her childhood. It had not been an easy path, and the scars, both visible and hidden, would remain with her always. But standing now among a pack that had embraced her fully, beside a father who cherished her deeply, and a mother whose sacrifice had shaped every part of who she had become, Mara understood finally that every difficult step of that long journey had led her exactly where she was always meant to be.